Call me Mom. Claire Bennett said it calmly, almost gently, but the words landed in the room like a glass dropped on marble. Every conversation stopped. The air itself seemed to freeze. Across the long dining table, her younger sister Emily stared at her, the color draining from her face as if someone had quietly turned off the lights behind her eyes. For a moment no one moved, no one breathed. Because standing beside Claire, one hand resting with quiet confidence at the small of her back, was a man no one expected to see there. Richard Carter, Daniel's father. And the gold band now resting on Claire's finger made it impossible to misunderstand what had just happened. 3 months earlier, Claire Bennett believed her life was simple, predictable, and almost perfectly mapped out. She lived in a quiet townhouse just outside Boston, about 15 miles from the harbor, the kind of place where neighbors waved from their driveways and the smell of fresh coffee drifted through open kitchen windows on Sunday mornings. Her days followed a rhythm she trusted. Work during the week, dinners with Daniel on Fridays, long walks through the park near the Charles River on Saturdays. She had always been the responsible one, the steady one, the person who believed that loyalty and patience eventually built the kind of life people dreamed about. Daniel Carter had been part of that dream for 4 years. He was confident, charming, and came from the kind of family that owned buildings instead of renting them. His father, Richard, controlled a successful investment firm downtown, the sort of place where men in tailored suits discussed numbers large enough to make headlines. But Daniel never seemed interested in power or money. At least that was what Claire believed. He told her once, while they sat on a wooden bench overlooking the water, that he admired how grounded she was. "You keep me balanced," he said, brushing a strand of windblown hair from her face. "You remind me what actually matters." Claire believed him because believing in people was something she had always done easily. It was the same instinct that made her open her home whenever her younger sister needed a place to land. Emily Bennett had always been different from Claire. Where Claire moved carefully, Emily moved quickly. Where Claire planned, Emily improvised. She had a magnetic personality that drew attention the moment she walked into a room, but her life was often a collection of sudden decisions and unfinished plans. Still, she was family, and family meant something to Claire. So when Emily called late one night saying she needed a place to stay for a while, Claire didn't hesitate. She made up the guest room with fresh sheets, cleared space in the closet, and told Daniel her sister would only be there for a few weeks until she figured things out. At the time it felt like the kind of small kindness that kept families connected. Claire could not have known that the moment Emily carried her suitcase through that front door, smiling with that familiar bright confidence, the quiet future Claire believed in had already begun to unravel in ways she never could have imagined. 3 months earlier, Claire believed that kindness always returned in the end, the way sunlight eventually returned after a long New England winter. The morning after Emily arrived, the house felt fuller, louder, almost younger. Claire woke just after 6:30, the same way she did every weekday, the soft light from the kitchen window stretching across the hardwood floor while the coffee maker hummed quietly on the counter. Outside, a cool spring breeze moved through the maple trees lining the street, and a delivery truck rumbled somewhere in the distance. Claire poured 2 cups of coffee instead of one and placed them on the small round table near the window. When Emily finally came downstairs nearly an hour later, still wrapped in the oversized gray sweater she slept in, she smiled the same easy smile she had used since childhood. "Thank you for letting me stay here," Emily said, tucking a loose strand of dark hair behind her ear while she sat down. "I promise it is only temporary." Claire waved the apology away with a small laugh because this was how things had always worked between them. Emily drifted when life became complicated, and Claire provided a place where things felt stable again. Later that afternoon, Daniel stopped by after work, arriving in his usual navy jacket and polished brown shoes that always seemed too formal for a quiet suburban street. He carried a paper bag from the bakery down the block, the one Claire loved because their cinnamon rolls were still warm when they came out of the oven. Emily greeted him with friendly enthusiasm, thanking him for the pastries before Claire even finished introducing them again, though of course they had met before during holidays and family gatherings. Daniel smiled politely, but Claire noticed something small she could not quite explain, a brief pause in his voice as if he were measuring his words more carefully than usual. Still, the evening passed comfortably enough. They ate dinner together at the small wooden table Claire had owned since college, talking about Emily searching for a new apartment and Daniel describing a renovation project his father's company was financing near downtown Boston. The conversation drifted easily between them, filled with the ordinary details that made life feel steady. Over the next few days, Emily settled into the house quickly. She filled the quiet rooms with music while she searched online for job listings, sometimes singing softly while folding laundry or watering the plants near the back patio. Daniel began stopping by more often after work, sometimes bringing takeout from a restaurant in Cambridge, other times simply dropping in to relax after long meetings with his father. At first, Claire welcomed the energy. The house felt warm and alive in a way it had not before. But gradually small things began to shift in ways that were difficult to name. Conversations sometimes paused when Claire walked into a room. Daniel and Emily occasionally shared quick glances that ended just a little too quickly when she noticed them. None of it was obvious enough to question, and Claire was not someone who looked for problems where none had been proven. She trusted the people she loved. And because she trusted them, she ignored the quiet voice inside her mind that whispered something in her carefully built world was beginning to change. Days passed in a rhythm that should have felt ordinary, yet something subtle beneath the surface continued to shift. Claire noticed it most in the evenings when the three of them shared the quiet space of the living room. The house itself was modest but comfortable, about 1,800 square feet with wide windows that faced the small backyard where a white fence separated her property from the neighbor's garden. Most nights Claire sat on the couch with her laptop reviewing project reports from work while Daniel leaned back in the armchair across from her, scrolling through emails from his father's company. Emily usually moved around the room with restless energy, sometimes flipping through television channels, other times pacing slowly while speaking on her phone in a voice that was playful and bright. One Tuesday evening Daniel arrived later than usual, just after 8:30, carrying a cardboard container from a seafood restaurant near the harbor. "I thought we could try something different tonight," he said, setting the bag on the kitchen counter while the warm smell of grilled salmon and lemon drifted through the room. Emily laughed softly and clapped her hands together like a child receiving a surprise. "You always bring the good food," she said with a grin that seemed to linger just a little longer than necessary. Claire watched the moment quietly while reaching for plates in the cabinet. Nothing about the exchange was openly strange, yet something in the way Daniel looked at Emily for a second too long stirred an uncomfortable thought Claire could not easily explain. Later that night, while Claire washed the dishes in the sink, she heard their voices from the living room, low and relaxed. Emily was telling a story about a trip she once took to Miami with friends, describing the warm ocean air and the music that filled the streets at night. Daniel laughed more freely than Claire had heard him laugh in weeks, the sound carrying easily down the hallway. Claire dried her hands slowly on a kitchen towel and paused beside the doorway. The two of them were sitting close on the couch, leaning slightly toward each other as if sharing a private joke. When Emily noticed Claire standing there, she shifted back immediately, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear while Daniel straightened his posture with a quick clearing of his throat. For a moment no one spoke. Claire forced a small smile and stepped forward, telling herself she was imagining things that were not really there. The following weekend Daniel suggested they all attend a small outdoor market near the waterfront, a place where local vendors sold handmade crafts and fresh pastries. The spring sun hung bright in the sky while people wandered between colorful booths and musicians played acoustic guitars near the edge of the pier. Claire walked beside Daniel while Emily drifted ahead, stopping at almost every stand to examine jewelry or scented candles. At one point Claire turned back to ask Daniel a question about dinner plans, only to notice his attention had shifted past her shoulder. His gaze followed Emily as she laughed with a vendor selling painted ceramic bowls. The look on his face lasted only a second before he realized Claire was watching. Then he smiled quickly and asked what she had been saying. Claire answered the question, but the quiet voice inside her mind returned stronger than before, whispering that the comfortable life she believed in might not be as steady as she once thought. The feeling followed Claire home from the waterfront market like a shadow that refused to disappear. It was not something she could explain with a single moment or a single word. It was a collection of small things that by themselves meant nothing, yet together formed a quiet pattern she could no longer ignore. That Sunday evening, the sky over Boston turned soft shades of orange and pale blue, while the neighborhood settled into the slow calm that came at the end of the weekend. Claire stood in the kitchen preparing dinner while the scent of roasted vegetables filled the air and the low hum of the dishwasher blended with distant traffic from the main road 2 blocks away. Emily sat at the kitchen island scrolling through her phone, occasionally laughing at something on the screen, while Daniel leaned against the counter with a glass of iced tea in his hand. The three of them talked about ordinary things at first. Work schedules, apartment listings Emily had found online, a charity event Daniel mentioned his father might attend next month. But halfway through the conversation, Claire noticed something subtle again. Emily asked Daniel questions that seemed unusually personal. She asked what it was like growing up in a wealthy family, what kind of vacations he took as a child, what his father expected from him in business. Daniel answered casually at first, but his attention slowly shifted more toward Emily than toward Claire. The two of them began exchanging stories and small jokes while Claire finished cooking. When she placed the plates on the table, they both thanked her politely, but the rhythm of the conversation had already changed. Later that night, Claire went upstairs to her bedroom to answer a few emails before bed. The house had grown quiet except for the faint sound of voices drifting up from the living room. At first she assumed the television had been left on, but after a moment she realized it was Emily and Daniel talking. Their voices were soft and relaxed, the kind of conversation people had when they forgot someone else might be nearby. Claire did not intend to listen, yet as she paused near the top of the staircase, a few words reached her clearly enough to make her heart tighten. Emily laughed softly and said something about how Daniel must have many choices when it came to relationships. Daniel responded with a tone Claire had rarely heard from him before, a mixture of amusement and curiosity. He said that life sometimes surprised people and that not everything was as simple as it appeared from the outside. The conversation faded when one of them lowered their voice, but the quiet tension inside Claire remained. She walked back into her bedroom slowly, closing the door behind her with careful silence. For several minutes, she sat at the edge of the bed staring at the soft glow of the bedside lamp, while her thoughts turned over the past few weeks. She remembered the quick glances she had seen between them, the sudden pauses in conversation, the way Daniel's attention seemed to follow Emily across a room, even when Claire was speaking. None of it was clear enough to accuse anyone of anything. Yet the calm certainty she once felt about her future had begun to crack in small, invisible places. Claire had always believed that trust meant giving people the benefit of doubt, but that night as she turned off the lamp and lay awake listening to the quiet house around her, she could not shake the feeling that something important was slowly slipping beyond her control. The next morning arrived with a quiet stillness that felt almost deliberate, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Claire woke just after 6 o'clock, the pale morning light slipping through the curtains and painting soft lines across the bedroom floor. For a moment she remained still, staring at the ceiling while the memory of the previous night drifted back into her thoughts. The conversation she had overheard between Emily and Daniel had not contained anything clearly wrong, yet the tone of it lingered in her mind like an unfinished sentence. Claire had always trusted her instincts, but she also believed that suspicion could damage relationships faster than truth could repair them. So she told herself that she would not jump to conclusions. She dressed for work as she always did, choosing a navy blouse and a pair of tailored gray slacks, and then walked downstairs into the kitchen where the familiar routine of the morning helped steady her thoughts. The coffee maker hummed softly while the scent of fresh ground beans filled the air. Outside the window, a school bus rolled slowly down the street, stopping briefly at the corner while a group of children climbed aboard. Everything about the morning appeared normal, yet Claire could not ignore the subtle difference in the atmosphere of her own home. Emily was already awake, sitting at the kitchen island with a bowl of cereal and her phone resting beside her hand. She looked up with an easy smile when Claire entered the room. "Good morning," she said brightly, as if nothing in the world could possibly be wrong. Claire returned the smile and poured herself a cup of coffee before asking whether Emily had heard back from any of the apartments she had been considering. Emily shrugged and said that she might schedule a few viewings later in the week. While they talked, Claire noticed something else that felt slightly unusual. Daniel's car was parked in the driveway outside, even though he had not planned to stay overnight. A few seconds later, he appeared in the hallway wearing the same shirt he had worn the day before, his hair slightly unkempt as though he had woken only moments earlier. Claire blinked once in quiet surprise. Daniel explained casually that he had stayed late watching a movie in the living room and had fallen asleep on the couch. Emily laughed and said she had done the same thing the night before after finishing a television series. The explanation sounded simple enough, yet Claire felt that familiar tightening in her chest again. She stirred her coffee slowly while the three of them stood together in the kitchen, exchanging small pieces of conversation about the day ahead. Daniel mentioned he needed to stop by his father's office in downtown Boston later that afternoon. Emily said she might take a walk through the nearby park to clear her mind. Claire nodded politely, but her thoughts had already begun drifting somewhere else. Because for the first time since Emily had moved into the house, Claire realized that trust was no longer the simple certainty it had once been. Something about the quiet morning light, the casual explanations, and the way Daniel avoided meeting her eyes for more than a second made her understand that the fragile balance of her life was beginning to tilt. And although she did not yet know exactly what truth waited beneath the surface, she could feel that the moment of discovery was moving closer with every passing day. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument could have been. Claire remained standing beside the chair near the window while the late afternoon sunlight stretched across the living room floor, catching the dust in the air and turning it into tiny floating sparks of gold. Daniel shifted his weight from one foot to the other as if he wanted to move closer to her, but was unsure whether he should. Emily leaned back slightly on the couch, folding her arms with a calm expression that looked almost rehearsed. For years Claire had believed she understood the people closest to her better than anyone else. Yet in that moment both of them looked like strangers standing inside a house that suddenly no longer felt like her own. Claire spoke first, her voice quiet but steady. "I think we should stop pretending that nothing is happening." Daniel inhaled slowly and opened his mouth as if to respond, but the words did not come immediately. Emily gave a small shrug and looked toward him before answering herself. "Claire, you are making this more dramatic than it needs to be. We were only talking." The sentence sounded simple, but the tone carried a sharp edge that had not been there before. Claire watched her sister carefully. For most of their lives, Emily had always avoided difficult conversations by turning them into jokes or brushing them aside with a smile. But today the smile felt different, more like a shield than a habit. Claire turned her attention back to Daniel. "I trusted you," she said quietly. The words hung in the room for a moment. Daniel ran a hand through his hair again and finally met her eyes. "Claire, nothing happened the way you are imagining it. We were just spending time together." The explanation sounded thin even before he finished speaking. Claire felt something inside her chest settle into a calm she had not expected. The fear and confusion that had followed her for weeks slowly gave way to a strange clarity, because the truth no longer depended on what they admitted. It existed in the space between their expressions, in the tension that neither of them could hide. Emily stood up from the couch and walked a few steps closer, her voice softer now, but still carrying a confidence that made Claire pause. "You always assume everything has to follow your rules," Emily said. "Life is not that simple. People change. Feelings change." The words were spoken gently, yet they cut through the room with quiet precision. Claire looked at her sister for a long moment, remembering the countless times she had defended Emily to friends who said she was unpredictable or selfish. She had always believed that beneath the impulsive decisions and restless energy, Emily cared about family the same way Claire did. Now that belief felt like something fragile breaking apart in slow motion. Daniel stepped forward then, lowering his voice as if hoping calm reason could repair what had already fractured. "Claire, please listen. I never meant for you to find out like this." The moment the words left his mouth, the room became completely still again. Claire felt the final piece of doubt disappear. Because those words were not a denial. They were an admission. The words settled into the room like the quiet closing of a door that could never be opened again. Claire did not move at first. She simply looked at Daniel, while the late afternoon light shifted slowly across the floor, stretching toward the walls as the sun began to sink lower outside. For weeks, she had carried a small hope that everything she suspected might still be wrong. Now that hope faded with surprising calm. Daniel seemed to realize what he had just said because his expression tightened almost immediately. "That is not what I meant," he added quickly, his voice careful and controlled as if he believed the situation could still be repaired with the right explanation. Claire watched him with a steady gaze that no longer held the confusion she had felt earlier. You said you did not mean for me to find out like this, she replied quietly. That means there was something to find out. Daniel hesitated, searching for words that could somehow rearrange the truth into something less damaging. Emily stepped forward before he could answer, her tone calm, but unmistakably firm. Claire, this did not start the way you think. People grow closer sometimes. It is not always planned. Claire felt a strange hollow sensation inside her chest, the kind that appears when a long-expected storm finally arrives, and there is nothing left to do but stand in the rain. She looked at her sister carefully, studying the confident posture and steady voice that once made Emily seem fearless in every situation. For years, Claire had been the person who helped repair Emily's mistakes, the person who believed family meant protecting each other even when things became difficult. Now Emily spoke as if this moment were simply another unexpected turn in life. Daniel finally exhaled and lowered his voice. Claire, I did care about you. Everything we had was real. The sentence lingered awkwardly in the air because the tense of his words revealed more than he intended. Claire nodded slowly. She believed him in a way. There had been real moments between them once, quiet evenings and future plans and promises that felt sincere at the time. But sincerity did not always guarantee permanence. Sometimes it only meant that people had believed their own words when they spoke them. Claire walked past the two of them toward the window and looked outside at the quiet street, where a neighbor watered a row of small rose bushes near the sidewalk. The normal rhythm of the world continued as if nothing important had happened inside the house behind her. For a few seconds no one spoke. Then Claire turned back toward them with a calm expression neither of them expected. I understand now, she said softly. Daniel took a small step forward, confusion crossing his face because the anger he expected never appeared. Claire's voice remained steady. You both made your decision before today. The only thing that changed is that I finally saw it. Emily opened her mouth to respond, but stopped when she realized there was nothing left to argue. Because Claire was right. The truth had already been decided long before this conversation began. Claire's calm response left the room suspended in a quiet tension that neither Daniel nor Emily seemed prepared for. Daniel had expected anger, accusations, maybe even tears, because those were the reactions people usually imagined when betrayal revealed itself. Instead, Claire simply stood near the window with her arms resting loosely at her sides, looking at them with a clarity that made the silence feel heavier than any argument. The afternoon light had faded into the softer tones of early evening, and the long shadows inside the living room stretched across the floor like quiet witnesses to everything that had just been said. Daniel spoke first again, his voice uncertain. Claire, we should talk about this properly. I do not want you to misunderstand what happened. Claire looked at him for a moment before answering, her tone even and composed. I do understand. That is the problem. Emily crossed her arms, shifting her weight slightly, as if the calm atmosphere frustrated her more than an emotional confrontation would have. Claire, you are acting like this is the end of the world. People move on. Relationships change. Daniel and I did not plan this, but we cannot pretend our feelings are not real either. The words hung in the air with quiet boldness. Claire studied her sister's expression carefully, noticing how comfortable Emily seemed standing beside Daniel now, as if the new reality had already settled into place for her. Perhaps it had been developing for much longer than Claire realized. Daniel glanced toward Emily briefly before returning his attention to Claire. I never wanted to hurt you, he said. Things just became complicated. Claire nodded slowly, as if she had expected that answer all along. Life becomes complicated when people make choices they do not want to explain, she replied softly. For a few seconds none of them spoke again. Outside, a car passed along the street, and the faint sound of its engine faded into the distance. The ordinary world continued as if nothing significant had shifted inside the small house. Claire walked toward the kitchen doorway, pausing near the counter where the coffee mug Emily had used earlier still rested beside the sink. She picked it up and rinsed it quietly under the faucet before setting it aside to dry. The simple motion felt strangely grounding after the conversation that had just unfolded. When she turned back toward them, her expression remained calm, but something in her eyes had changed. The hesitation and uncertainty that once lived there had disappeared, replaced by a quiet determination neither Daniel nor Emily recognized yet. I think you should both leave tonight, Claire said gently. Daniel blinked in surprise, clearly expecting another attempt to talk things through. Claire, we can figure this out if we just take some time. She shook her head once, the movement small but firm. There is nothing left to figure out. The decision has already been made. Emily looked at Daniel briefly and then back at Claire, her voice carrying a hint of disbelief. You are just going to walk away like that? Claire met her gaze steadily. No, she answered. I am simply stepping out of the place you already took. Daniel did not move for several seconds after Claire spoke. The words she had said were simple, almost gentle, yet they carried a finality that neither he nor Emily had expected. He looked around the living room as if the familiar space might offer some kind of solution, but the quiet house only echoed the reality settling over the moment. Claire stood near the kitchen counter with a calm posture that made it clear she was not speaking out of impulse or temporary anger. Emily was the first to react, letting out a short breath of disbelief. You are serious, she said, her tone sharper now. Claire nodded once. Yes. Daniel took a slow step forward, his voice careful, as if he hoped the situation could still be redirected. Claire, please listen. We have been together for 4 years. You cannot just erase that in one evening. Claire met his gaze without raising her voice. I am not erasing anything. I am accepting what already happened. The room grew quiet again. Daniel glanced briefly toward Emily, then back at Claire as though searching for some sign of the woman he had known before. The woman who once believed every promise he made about their future together. But the person standing in front of him now looked different, not colder, but steadier in a way he had never seen before. Emily shifted her weight and walked slowly toward the hallway, her expression thoughtful rather than apologetic. You are making this more dramatic than it needs to be, she said. People break up all the time. Claire watched her sister carefully. That might be true, she answered softly. But not everyone breaks trust with their own family while doing it. Emily did not respond immediately. For a moment the confidence in her posture faded slightly, replaced by a flicker of discomfort she could not hide. Daniel rubbed his hands together nervously before speaking again. I should talk to my father about this, he said quietly, as though the situation might somehow require a businesslike solution. Claire almost smiled at the irony of that thought. Your father has nothing to do with this decision, she replied. The sentence seemed to surprise both of them. Daniel frowned slightly. What do you mean by that? Claire walked toward the front door and opened it, allowing the cool evening air to drift inside. Streetlights had begun to glow along the quiet road outside, while the distant hum of traffic carried through the neighborhood. I mean that the situation is simple now, she said calmly. You both chose what you wanted. Now I am choosing what I want. Emily looked toward Daniel again, as if silently asking whether he intended to argue further, but he remained still. Perhaps for the first time he understood that persuasion would not change Claire's mind. After a long moment, Emily picked up her handbag from the couch. Fine, she said quietly. If this is how you want it. Claire did not answer. She simply stepped aside and held the door open. One by one they walked past her into the evening air. When the door finally closed behind them, the house returned to silence. Claire stood there for several seconds listening to the fading sound of Daniel's car starting in the driveway. The life she once believed was permanent had just driven away. Yet instead of emptiness, the quiet house held a strange sense of clarity that felt almost like the beginning of something new. The house remained quiet long after the sound of Daniel's car disappeared down the street. Claire stood near the front door for a moment, her hand still resting lightly against the cool wood as the silence settled around her. For the first time in weeks, there were no uncertain conversations drifting through the hallway, no lingering tension hiding behind polite smiles. The quiet felt different now, not empty, but honest. Claire slowly walked back into the living room where the fading evening light stretched across the couch where Daniel and Emily had been sitting earlier that day. The coffee mug Emily had used still sat on the small table, untouched since the moment Claire rinsed it at the sink. Claire picked it up and placed it in the cabinet, a small act that somehow felt like closing a chapter that had already ended. She moved through the house slowly, turning off the lights that had been left on and opening the windows to let the cool night air drift inside. Outside, the neighborhood continued with its ordinary rhythm. A dog barked somewhere down the street, and a car passed beneath the glow of the streetlights. Life continued in quiet motion, unaware that something important had just shifted inside one small home. Claire returned to the living room and sat down on the couch, allowing herself to breathe deeply for the first time all day. The past few hours replayed in her mind with surprising clarity. Daniel's hesitation. Emily's calm certainty. The moment when Daniel admitted more than he intended. For a long time, Claire had believed that betrayal would shatter her completely if it ever happened. Yet sitting there now, she realized something unexpected. The pain had not destroyed her sense of self. Instead, it had removed something false from her life, something she had trusted simply because she wanted to believe it was real. Claire leaned back against the couch and closed her eyes for a moment, letting the cool breeze from the open window brush against her face. She thought about the years she had spent planning a future with Daniel, the house they once talked about buying near the water, the quiet weekends they imagined sharing together. Those plans had once felt permanent, yet now they seemed like distant sketches from another life. The strange thing was that Claire did not feel anger the way she once imagined she would. Instead, she felt a growing sense of clarity about what mattered and what did not. Trust, respect, and honesty were not things that could be negotiated once they were broken. Without them, there was nothing left to rebuild. Claire opened her eyes again and looked around the living room that had once held so many comfortable memories. The house still belonged to her. Her work still waited for her in the morning. Her life had not disappeared just because two people had chosen a different path. In fact, the quiet certainty filling the room suggested something else entirely. For the first time in a long while, Claire realized she was no longer standing inside a story someone else had helped write. Whatever happened next would be entirely her own choice. Morning arrived quietly, carrying the soft pale light that filtered through the curtains and spread slowly across the living room floor. Claire woke just after 6, the same way she always had, but the silence in the house felt different now. For the first time in weeks, there were no uncertain voices in the hallway, no tension waiting behind the kitchen door. Only the quiet rhythm of her own routine remained. She walked downstairs and turned on the coffee maker while the faint scent of roasted beans began to fill the kitchen. Outside, the neighborhood was beginning to wake. A newspaper landed on a nearby driveway with a soft thud, and a jogger passed along the sidewalk wearing bright running shoes that flashed in the early light. Claire wrapped both hands around the warm coffee mug and stood beside the window for a moment, watching the ordinary world move forward exactly as it always had. The events of the previous evening felt almost distant now, like a storm that had passed during the night, leaving the air clearer afterward. Claire did not pretend that the pain had disappeared. The memory of Daniel and Emily together still carried a sharp edge that would take time to dull. But the heavy uncertainty that had filled her thoughts for weeks was gone. In its place was a quiet understanding that some truths, once revealed, brought a strange kind of freedom. She thought briefly about the future she once imagined with Daniel, the plans they had discussed so confidently. A house near the water, quiet weekends together, the simple picture of stability she believed they shared. That future had disappeared the moment trust disappeared with it. Yet standing in the quiet kitchen, Claire realized something important. Losing a plan did not mean losing her life. It only meant the story had taken a turn she had not expected. Claire finished her coffee and walked back into the living room where the morning sunlight had begun to brighten the entire space. The house looked the same as it had the day before, yet it felt different now because the uncertainty had been replaced by choice. She opened the windows wider, letting the cool breeze move through the rooms, carrying away the last traces of the tension that had lived there. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang once, marking the beginning of a new hour. Claire allowed herself a small, quiet smile. She did not know exactly what the future would bring, but she knew something about herself that had been hidden until now. She had the strength to step away from a life that no longer respected her, and the courage to begin again without regret. Outside, the morning continued to unfold, calm and steady, and Claire understood that this was not the end of her story at all. It was simply the moment she began writing the next chapter herself.